The last thing an astropath loses is not their sight. It is the ability to tell the difference between a thought that is theirs and a thought that arrived. My name is not important. What I am is. I am the person who found Kael Morn's transcription records in the archive of a relay station that no longer appears on any active Adeptus Astra Telepathica chart. I am the person who spent 4 months reconstructing the sequence of events that preceded Vigil-Secundus going dark. Not destroyed, not decommissioned, not lost to enemy action. Dark. The specific technical classification reserved for a station that is still structurally intact, still drawing power, still registering atmospheric integrity within habitable parameters, but from which no transmission has been received, and to which no transmission has been successfully delivered in the 11 months since the last logged contact. I want to be precise about what dark means before we begin. It does not mean silent. Silence implies an absence of signal. What the Adeptus Astra Telepathica classifies as dark is something more specific than silence. It is a station from which the psychic signature of its astropathic choir has been cleanly, completely, and inexplicably removed. Not killed, not severed. Removed the way a candle flame is removed when you cup your hand around it. The wick is still there, the wax is still there, the air that fed the flame is still there. There is simply no longer any light. Vigil-Secundus went dark on the 73rd day after Kael Morn received the 12th Seal. I have spent 4 months learning what those 73 days contained. What I am about to tell you is not a warning. I am past the point where warning is the appropriate category. What I am about to tell you is a record, assembled from transcription logs, station archive fragments, medical intake reports, and one document that Kael Morn wrote by hand on standard vellum parchment and sealed into the relay chamber's foundational cavity behind a section of wall plating in a location that suggests he expected the wall to be examined. He expected someone to look. He prepared for that. He left something to find. That is the kind of man he was. That is the kind of man this story produced and destroyed and preserved, in that order. The record begins 19 years before Vigil-Secundus went dark. The soul binding does not take your sight cleanly. That is the first thing Kael Morn's personal log establishes, not as a complaint, but as a technical record. He was a precise man. He logged what was accurate. What the soul binding takes is the darkness, the ordinary biological darkness of closed eyes or an unlit room, the darkness that means absence of light and nothing more. After the binding ceremony at the Scholastica Psychana, after the 10,000 voice choir of the Astronomicon was channeled through his untrained mind at a volume that broke something structural in the architecture of his perception, what remained in the space where darkness used to live was something else entirely. A low, constant luminescence, not warm, not comforting. The specific cold light of 10,000 minds burning simultaneously, impressed so deeply into his psychic sense during the binding that it never fully faded. He describes it in his log as living inside a bruise, not painful, just always present, just the permanent reminder that something was done to him that cannot be undone, and that the thing it was done in service of, the great lighthouse of the Astronomicon, burning at the heart of the Imperium to guide 10,000 ships through the void, neither knows his name, nor would recognize his contribution if it did. He made peace with this in his first year of service. He was, by every administrative measure, a model astropath, precise in his transcriptions, methodical in his archive practices, reliable in the specific, unglamorous, essential way that keeps a relay station functioning across decades of continuous operation. Not brilliant, not exceptional, simply present. Consistently, professionally, quietly present. 19 years of it. He noted the anomalous archive entry on the 31st day of his 19th year. He was cross-referencing a transmission log from his first year of service. Administrative work, the kind that accumulates when a station operates long enough, and which must eventually be processed by whoever draws the short lot. Morn had drawn it twice in 19 years, which he noted without resentment. He was working through the log sequentially, the way he worked through everything. Start at the beginning, proceed in order, do not skip entries, because skipped entries are where errors accumulate, and errors in a relay station's archive are not abstract. They are missed, distress calls, and undelivered orders, and the specific terrible gap between a ship that needed to know something and the moment that knowledge arrived too late. The entry was logged as received on the day of his soul binding, the exact day. The timestamp placed it at 3 hours and 14 minutes after the binding ceremony concluded, which means it arrived, technically, while he was still unconscious in the Scholastica Psychana's recovery ward, while he was still learning how to exist inside his new luminescent not darkness, while he was not yet capable of receiving anything from anyone. It was logged under his designation as his received transmission. The classification code sealed over it was not inquisitorial. He checked. Inquisitorial classification codes follow a documented format that any Adeptus Astra telepathica archivist of his experience can recognize on sight. This was not that format. It was older. The seal was Adeptus Astra telepathica internal. That much he could confirm. But the authorization level listed above his own was a designation he had never encountered in 19 years of service. Not classified above his clearance, which he would have recognized. Something structurally different from clearance entirely, as though the concept of clearance did not apply to this category of entry, as though it had been sealed not to keep people out, but to keep something in. He filed a query about the classification code. He submitted it through standard administrative channels, flagged as routine, and returned to his cross-referencing. The response came back in 11 seconds. This entry does not exist. Proceed. He sat with this for a while. Not with alarm. Alarm was not his first response to things that didn't add up. His first response, honed over 19 years of managing the inherent strangeness of psychic relay work, was to slow down. To be more precise. To note the specific shape of the anomaly before doing anything about it. He noted, the response time of 11 seconds was implausible for a routine administrative query processed through official channels. Standard processing time was measured in hours. 11 seconds meant the response was automated, preloaded, waiting for this exact query with this exact answer already composed. He noted, the instruction to proceed was grammatically unusual. Note this entry is sealed above your clearance, the standard language. No query referred to senior administration, the escalation language. Proceed, a directive, not an explanation. The instruction of something that does not want to discuss what it is telling you to ignore. He noted, his binding day was 19 years ago, and in 19 years of meticulous archival practice, he had cross-referenced every transmission log from his first year of service, except this one, because this cross-reference cycle had only just arrived, and the entry had been waiting in the log for 19 years for precisely this moment. He did not note anything after that. He returned to work. He wrote the response time on a separate scrap of paper and folded it into his sleeve. That evening, during the standard transmission queue, he transcribed 14 routine relay messages, flagged 2 for priority routing, logged his caloric intake and rest cycle as required by station protocol, and prepared for his assigned sleep period. At some point during the transition between wakefulness and sleep, the texture of the Astronomicon changed. He described this in his log with the care of a man trying to be accurate about something that resists accuracy. Not louder, not brighter, not more present. It had been present, at the edge of his perception, every moment of every day for 19 years. He knew its texture, the way you know the texture of your own breathing. The same way you notice when your breathing changes, without being able to explain precisely what has changed. Something in the quality of it. Something in what it was doing behind the noise it always made. He sat up. He reached for his transcription harness. He did not know why. His training had not directed him to. His professional instincts, honed to recognize incoming psychic material by its specific pressure and frequency, and the particular way it announced itself to a prepared receiver, detected nothing. No signal, no pulse, no cascade from the choir relay that indicated synchronized incoming material. Nothing that should have sent his hands to the harness. And yet, his hands found it in the dark with the ease of 19 years of muscle memory. The quill pressed against the first available sheet of vellum. He did not direct it. He watched it move, watched in his specific not darkness, the sense of his own arm's position, and the pressure of the harness and the motion of the quill registering against the page. With the particular quality of attention you give to something happening in your body that you did not authorize. The symbols were unlike anything in his 19 years of received material. They were organized, deliberate, structured into groups with clear internal consistency, not the impressionistic rush of unfiltered warp material, not the corrupted fragments of a degraded long-distance relay, not anything his training had given him a category for. They were precise. They had been composed by something that wanted them to arrive exactly as they arrived, undegraded, unfiltered, and delivered not through the relay infrastructure of the Adeptus Astrotelepathica, but through the older, quieter, less monitored channel of a man's sleeping mind. His hand stopped. He sat in the cold luminescence of his permanent not darkness, and he counted the groups. 11. He counted them again. He folded the page carefully and pressed it between his palm and the inside of his sleeve, next to the response time he had written that afternoon. He did not sleep for the remaining hours of his rest cycle. He lay in his bunk and listened to the Astronomicon burn, and for the first time in 19 years, he was not certain the sound he was hearing came entirely from outside himself. The 12th group has not yet arrived. Morn does not know that yet. Neither does the audience. They will both find out at the same time. This story was written so that it would not stay where it happened. Something is still receiving. Something has always been received. And somewhere in the relay network, right now, someone is reaching for their harness. There are messages the Imperium has received and recorded and sealed and buried and never, in 10,000 years of bureaucratic certainty, managed to make stop being true. 3 days. That is how long Cael Morn spent with the symbols before he understood that decoding them was not the point. That the symbols were not a cipher to be solved, but a shape to be recognized. The way you recognize a face, not by analyzing its components, but by the sudden, specific comprehension that arrives whole, that bypasses the analytical mind entirely and lands somewhere older and quieter and more certain. He understood this on the morning of the 4th day. He noted it in his log without elaboration, the way he noted everything, as a fact, stripped of the discomfort that produced it. The symbols are not waiting to be decoded. They are waiting to be known. He did not know what he meant by this when he wrote it. He would later. For now he set the question of meaning aside and returned to what he was trained to do. What 19 years had made second nature, the investigative reflex of a man who trusts process over intuition, even when intuition is already 3 steps ahead. He ran a pattern match search, not a translation query. He was precise about this distinction in his log, and the precision matters. A translation query asks the archive, "What does this mean?" A pattern match asks the archive, "Where have I seen this shape before?" The first question assumes the archive has a key. The second assumes only that the archive has a memory. The Vigil-Secundus archive had been accumulating memory for 40 years. He set the cogitator working and returned to his transmission queue. 9 hours, 14 minutes. That was the processing time. He logged it automatically when the result arrived. Not because it was anomalous, but because he logged everything. Because 19 years had made the logging faster than thought. One result, a sealed archival entry. Different classification code from the binding day entry, but the same structural tier, that quality he had noticed and could not name, the quality that felt less like clearance and more like containment. The entry was not at Vigil-Secundus. It was a reference, a ghost record, the kind an archive generates when it knows a file exists somewhere in the network without having access to the file itself. A shadow of something sealed elsewhere. Location: Vigil Tertius. The relay station is 2 nodes down the network chain. Timestamp: 11 years prior. He queried Vigil Tertius through the standard astropathic relay. He composed the query carefully, not asking about the sealed entry directly, which would trigger the same automated response the binding day entry had triggered. He asked instead whether the station maintained records pertaining to the classification designation, framed as an administrative cross-reference. Routine language. The language of bureaucracy performed convincingly enough that no automated system would recognize it as anything else. The response came back in 6 hours. Not an automated response, a transmission, routed through the standard relay, carrying the faint but distinct psychic signature of a junior astropath at the other end. Someone who had received his query, processed it, and composed a reply. 3 words. Vigil Tertius is dark. He sat with that for a long time. Dark was not a word the Adeptus Astra Telepathica used casually. Dark was not decommissioned, not reassigned, not closed for operational reasons. Dark was the classification that meant a station had stopped producing psychic signature without explanation. That the choir which had been generating the station's presence in the astropathic network had, in the absence of any documented catastrophe, simply ceased to register. The flame still burning in the wick, but no longer producing light. Vigil Tertius had gone dark 11 years ago. The ghost record in Vigil-Secundus's archive, the shadow of a sealed entry bearing the same structural classification as his binding day file, had been logged at Vigil Tertius 11 years ago. He did not yet know what the symbols meant. He did not yet know what the sealed entries contained. But he knew the shape of the pattern, the way he had known the symbols were not a cipher, not through analysis, but through the specific cold comprehension that arrives whole. Something had been received at Vigil Tertius 11 years ago, something that bore the same classification as what had been received at Vigil-Secundus 19 years ago. And 11 years ago, Vigil Tertius had gone dark. He wrote this in his log, flatly, precisely, without comment. Then he wrote one additional line. Query: how many relay stations have gone dark in the last 400 years? Cross-referenced with the classification designation. Submitting. He submitted the query. He returned to work. He transcribed his evening transmission queue with the same methodical care he brought to everything. And he ate his evening rations, and he logged his caloric intake, and he did not sleep. He found Sarah Ival the next morning. Or rather, he went looking for her, which amounts to the same thing at Vigil-Secundus, because Sarah Ival, Astropath Primus, 63 years of continuous service, occupies the same corner of the same corridor at the same hour every morning, with the consistency of a geographical feature. She is the station's oldest resident by 21 years. She arrived before the current commanding overseer was born. She has outlasted 4 station commanders, 2 major infrastructure overhauls, and the complete turnover of every other astropath currently serving at Vigil-Secundus, including Morn himself. She is blind in the biological way, complete absence of light perception. The original tissue long since adapted to its permanent darkness. She navigates by the map she has built over 63 years of walking the same corridors, and she does so with a precision that makes observers forget she is navigating at all. She simply moves through the station the way the station itself moves through space, with the unhurried certainty of something that has been doing this long enough that the possibility of error has stopped feeling relevant. Morn had spoken to her perhaps 40 times in 19 years. She was not unfriendly. She was simply complete. The quality of someone who had finished becoming what they were going to be and no longer required the friction of becoming to feel present. He had always found her slightly unnerving in the specific way that total self-possession is unnerving to someone still in the process of constructing theirs. He showed her the symbols by pressing the vellum into her hands. He did not speak while she read. She read with her fingertips, her touch moving across the page with a slowness that he initially mistook for methodical examination, but gradually understood was something else. She was not reading the symbols. She already knew what they said. She was counting them. Her stillness when she finished was total, not the stillness of someone processing information, the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment for a very long time and has just arrived at it, and is deciding, in the space between receiving and responding, what kind of person they are going to be about it. She chose truthfulness. She told him about Vigil-Tertius without being asked. She had served there for 1 year, early in her career, when she was still the kind of astropath who moved between stations frequently, accumulating experience before settling into the long, deep stillness of dedicated service. She had left 3 months before it went dark. She had never known why it went dark. She had made, she said, with the specific unsentimental tone of someone describing a professional decision that cost them something they had not expected to pay. A deliberate choice not to investigate. Not because she lacked curiosity, because in 63 years she had learned that certain doors, once opened, do not close behind you. And she had wanted, for reasons she acknowledged were personal and therefore imprecise, to remain a person who could still stand in a corridor and feel the ordinary weight of one more day of service. Then she reached into the inner fold of her robe, a gesture so familiar that it had clearly been performed many times, the gesture of a hand going to something it has touched regularly for years, and produced a piece of paper, folded so many times it was nearly translucent. The creases are permanent. The paper itself is soft with handling, the way paper becomes when it has been unfolded and refolded by careful hands, enough times to record the habit in the fibers. She unfolded it. The motion was slow and specific, each fold reversed in sequence, the way you handle something irreplaceable. She pressed it into his hands. 11 symbols, arranged in the same groups as the ones he had transcribed in the dark of his rest period. Identical, not similar, not parallel, not structurally comparable. Identical, to the precision that his 19 years of trained pattern recognition could confirm. He held the paper and did not speak. Below the symbols, in handwriting, he did not recognize. Not Ival's, not any hand he knew. A single line of standard imperial script. The 12th arrives with the receiver. He read it twice. Then he looked up at her. A reflex, the instinct toward eye contact when something requires a response, the reflex you carry for decades after the eyes stop working. She was already facing him. Her sightless face turned toward him, with the precision of someone who has learned to aim attention without the instrument that attention usually travels through. He asked her what the symbols meant, what the seals were, what arrives with the receiver. She refolded the paper, precisely. Each crease returned to its permanent groove. Her hands moved without hesitation, the motion of someone who has rehearsed this, who has unfolded and refolded this paper in the dark of their quarters more times than they have counted. The way you handle something you cannot put down and cannot stop putting down. She returned it to the fold of her robe. They are not a message, she said. They are a record. Something is logging what will happen. It logged 11 things that have already happened across 400 years, with a precision no astropathic transmission should be capable of. The degradation alone should have destroyed the detail. Long-distance warp transit corrupts specificity. You know this. You have spent 19 years watching exactly how much gets lost in transit. These lost nothing. Across 400 years, they lost nothing. She paused. In the pause, he could hear the station, its low structural vibration, the distant hum of the atmospheric recyclers, the particular acoustic quality of a corridor that has absorbed 63 years of one person's footsteps. The 12th seal is not a prediction, she said. A prediction implies uncertainty, implies a future that could be otherwise. What I am describing is something that arrived already knowing how it ended. The 12th seal was not sent to tell you what might happen. Her voice, when she said the next words, was not unkind. It was the voice of someone delivering something they have been carrying on behalf of another person for a very long time and have grown very tired of the wait. It was sent to describe what is currently happening. To you, specifically. I have been waiting 19 years for whoever received the binding night transmission to find me. She turned her face slightly away. Not avoidance, just the slight reorientation of someone whose attention has moved inward, processing something they have processed before and have not yet finished processing. I did not expect it to take this long. A pause, short, the length of a breath held and released. I did not expect it to be someone I would want to warn. Sarah Eval has waited 19 years. The paper she carries has been folded and unfolded so many times, the creases are permanent. She did not want to warn Morn because warning him is easy. She wanted to warn him because the seal says she does, and she does not yet know whether those are the same thing. She has known his name for 19 years. She learned it the same way he learned the symbols, in the dark, without asking for it. The third transmission begins where the paper ends. Chapter 3. The seals themselves. The first seal described in exact detail the fall of Cadia. It was written 400 years before the first stone was laid. Eval's quarters were the oldest room in Vigil-Secundus, not by design, by accumulation. 40 years of a single person's presence does something to a space that no amount of institutional maintenance can fully undo. It settles into the walls the way weather settles into stone, slowly, specifically, until the room stops being a room and becomes something closer to an extension of the person who has inhabited it long enough to leave their shape in the air. The walls were lined with transcription records in Eval's handwriting, stacked in ordered columns from floor to ceiling on 3 sides. Each column labeled in the precise shorthand she had developed over 6 decades of service. The fourth wall held a single narrow viewport, sealed and pressurized, through which the void showed its permanent, indifferent black. Morn had never been inside it before. He noticed, sitting across from her in the room's only visitor chair, a piece of furniture that looked as though it had been placed there decades ago for a guest who rarely came. That the transcription records nearest to him were dated from her Vigil-Tertius posting. 1 year of records. He could read the dates on the spines. He did not reach for them. She made no offer of warming fluid, No gesture toward the comfort rituals that punctuate difficult conversations. She simply sat, her sightless face angled toward the middle distance, and began. "The record I am about to give you," she said, "is not mine. I am its custodian. There is a difference, and it matters, because what I am about to tell you will feel like information, and it is not information. It is the weight. Once I give it to you, you will carry it the way I have carried it, which means you will carry it always, which means you should understand before I begin that there is no version of this conversation that ends with you being the person you were before it." Morn said nothing. In his log, he noted that he understood this to be true before she said it, and that her saying it was not a warning, but a professional courtesy. The kind extended between people who respect precision enough to name what is about to happen before it happens. She reached into the fold of her robe, not for the paper this time, for something else. A small transcription data slate, old enough that its casing had developed the particular matte finish of frequently handled equipment, the finish of a tool that has been picked up and set down 10,000 times. She held it without activating it, the way you hold something you know by touch well enough that looking at it is unnecessary. "I will tell you the seals in the order they were received," she said. "I will not tell you all of them. I will tell you enough. You are an astropath of 19 years. You understand signal density. You understand when more data obscures rather than clarifies. I will give you the signal. The density is already inside you. It arrived with the symbols." He did not argue. She was correct. "The first seal," she said, "was received at a relay station called Vigil-Primus, which no longer exists and has not existed for 380 years. The receiving astropath's name was Theoden Vrath. He was 26 years old. He had been in service for 3 years. He transcribed what he received and sealed it himself, under a classification code he invented on the spot, because nothing in the standard codex applied, and he spent the remaining 40 years of his career attempting to have it investigated through official channels, and he died waiting. The first seal described the fall of Cadia, the pylons, the collapse of the Cadian Gate, the emergence of the Great Rift, what the common tongue now calls the Cicatrix Maledictum, and the splitting of the Imperium into 2 halves, separated by a wound in reality that no military force and no political will has yet succeeded in closing. It described the names of commanders present, the sequence of tactical failures, the specific moment when the decision was made that would determine the outcome. Every detail has been verified. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica cross-referenced Theoden Vrath's sealed transcription against the historical record after Cadia fell. The match was complete, not approximate, complete, to the level of personal names and exact sequences of events that no document composed before the fact should have been able to contain. She paused. Let it settle. Theoden Vrath received the first seal 380 years before Cadia fell. He spent 40 years trying to make the Imperium listen. The Imperium classified his transcription, reassigned him twice, and eventually gave him a quiet posting at a station in an uncontested subsector where he could trouble no one important. He is not unique. He is the pattern. Morn asked about the other seals. Not all of them. He understood her point about signal density, and he trusted her judgment about what he needed. He asked which ones she had verified herself, which ones she had held in her hands and measured against the historical record, and confirmed. She told him 3 more. He will not reproduce their full content here, and neither will I. Not because it is too horrifying to describe, though it is, but because the horror is not in the events themselves. The Imperium is full of catastrophic events. Its entire history is a catalogue of catastrophic events survived through attrition and maintained through collective refusal to calculate the true cost. What makes the seals horrifying is not what they describe. It is how they describe it. The language is wrong, not corrupted. Wrong in the specific way that a perfect translation is wrong. The way that a text composed in one language and rendered into another with complete technical accuracy still carries the faint foreignness of something that was not originally thinking in this tongue. The seals read like reports, written by something that understands human events completely and has never experienced a single one of them. The syntax is flawless. The vocabulary is precise. The emotional register is absent, not suppressed, not clinical in the way that trained personnel learn to be clinical, but genuinely, constitutively absent, the way that color is absent from a sound. Whatever composed the seals understood exactly what it was recording. It did not feel any of it. The third seal, Ival said, described the destruction of a Space Marine chapter, not a defeat, not a withdrawal, the complete verified elimination of every living member of a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, including their fleet, their fortress monastery, their gene seed stocks, and the 17 successor aspirants who were off-site at the time of the attack and were hunted down individually over the following 6 months. The seal named them, all 17, in the order they died. She stopped. I verified it against inquisitorial records I should not have had access to, and will not explain how I obtained it. Every name was correct. Every sequence was correct. The last aspirant, a 17-year-old novitiate named Drav Sol, killed in a drainage culvert on an agri-world so obscure it barely registers on imperial charts, is listed in the seal with more care than any of the others. More words, more specific detail. As though whatever composed the seals paused at this one entry for reasons that the absence of emotional register cannot fully conceal. She was quiet for a moment. I have thought about that pause for 11 years. I do not have a conclusion. I have only the pause itself, sitting in the middle of a document composed by something that does not feel, feeling something. The question of authorship. He asked it directly, because he was a precise man, and because the question had been building since she began, and because the only thing worse than asking it was carrying it unasked. She answered as directly as the answer permitted. Nobody knew. Every investigation the Adeptus Astrotelepathica had commissioned into the origin of the transmission had been classified before its conclusions were distributed. The fragments that survived classification, recovered from secondary sources, from personal records of investigators who had copied their notes before the sealing orders arrived, from the kind of archival sediment that accumulates at the edges of official suppression, pointed toward a consistent set of negative conclusions. The signal did not originate from within the Materium. That much every investigation had confirmed. It carried no warp corruption signature, none of the psychic contamination markers that accumulate on transmissions that have traveled through the Immaterium's deeper currents. It bore no resemblance to any known Xenos communication format in the Adeptus Astrotelepathica's extensive and carefully sealed Xenocommunications archive. It did not match any profile generated by any inquisitorial analysis of chaos-sourced psychic material. What it matches, Ival said, in the one fragment of investigative record I trust absolutely, because I copied it myself from the personal notes of an investigator who died 3 weeks after writing it. What it matches is nothing, no category, no precedent. The investigator's final note on the origin question was 4 words. She recited them with the flatness of someone who has recited them many times and has long since stopped hoping that repetition would make them mean something different. Older than the Astronomicon. Morn sat with that. The Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon maintained by the Emperor's will and the continuous sacrifice of 10,000 lives, the lighthouse that had guided humanity through the void for 10,000 years. The thing that had burned its light into his perception during his soul binding and had lived at the edge of his consciousness ever since. The thing that was so foundational to human civilization in this era that imagining its absence was like imagining the absence of gravity. Something older than that had composed the seals. Something that had been here, in some form, in some capacity, receiving or observing or recording, before the Emperor lit the beacon, before the Imperium, before the current age of humanity entirely. And it had been sending these reports, these precise and emotionally empty records of human catastrophe at irregular intervals to specific astropaths through a mechanism that bypassed every known channel of psychic communication for as long as anyone had managed to trace the record back. Why? Morn said. Not a complete question. The rest of it was implicit. Ival's expression shifted. The first time in the conversation that something moved across her face that was not composure. That, she said quietly, is what the 12th Seal addresses. She read it to him. Not the full content. I will honor here what the record honors. And the record does not give the full content of the 12th Seal in this conversation, for reasons that will become clear. What Ival read aloud in her quarters that morning was enough, more than enough, precisely calibrated to the threshold of what a trained, 19-year astropath with a disciplined mind and a professional's relationship to the unthinkable could receive without losing the thread of himself. It described him, his name, his station, his specific particular 19 years, not summarized, not generalized, but rendered in the same clean, emotionless, comprehensive detail as the fall of Cadia and the death of a chapter and the 17 names listed in order of dying. The night his hands moved without his direction. The symbols he transcribed. The archive entry was found by accident. The response time he had written on a scrap of paper and folded into his sleeve. That detail, the scrap of paper, the fold of his sleeve, the specific location of the thing he had done alone in his quarters, without anyone present. He asked her to read it again, not with urgency, with the tone of a man asking for confirmation of something he had already understood the first time, because understanding it once had not been sufficient, and he needed to understand it again to be certain that understanding it was real. She read it again. It did not change. He was not reading a prophecy. He was reading a record of something that was currently happening to him, composed by something that had observed it before he had lived it, preserved in a transmission cycling through the warp since before the Astronomicon burned, delivered to him through a mechanism that bypassed 19 years of professional psychic shielding, as though the shielding were courtesy rather than architecture. Something had been watching him. Not since yesterday. Since before he was born. Since before the relay station that shaped him existed. Since before, possibly, the civilization that created him drew its first collective breath. The silence after the second reading was different from the silence after the first. Fuller. The kind of silence that has weight and temperature. He asked the only question left. Does the 12th Seal describe what happens next? Ival was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he counted his own heartbeats, the involuntary habit of a mind that measures things when it has nothing else to do with its precision. Yes, she said. Then why are you still here? Why did you wait for me to find you instead of warning someone who could? She interrupted him, very quietly. The interruption of someone who has rehearsed this conversation and knows which question comes next, and knows what the answer is, and has known for 11 years that the answer would not be satisfying. Because I needed to see if the seal was right about one thing, about what you would do when you heard it, about the choice it says you make. He asked if it was right. She did not answer. She pressed the data slate into his hands. She told him to find the last entry, to read it himself. He found it. He read it. His hands holding the data slate in the specific luminescent not darkness of his permanent blindness were shaking. He did not tell her what it said. He has not told anyone what it said. The record contains it, sealed into the foundational cavity of Vigil-Secundus's relay chamber wall in his handwriting, on vellum parchment, waiting for whoever looks. I have read it. I will not read it to you yet. Some things should arrive in the order they cost. The seals have been given weight, texture, and the specific horror of their authorship. The 12th seal has been confirmed to describe an ongoing event with a specific choice at its center. The last line of the seal has been read by Morn, confirmed to exist by the narrator, and deliberately withheld. The audience now knows that the narrator has seen the full record. They do not yet know what it cost the narrator to find it. The data slate is still warm from her hands. It has been warm for 11 years. Some things once held do not cool. The fourth transmission begins in the dark. Chapter 4. What the station keeps. That night, every astropath at Vigil-Secundus received the same transmission. Not from outside the station, from inside it, from each other. It began with the youngest. Morn was in his quarters when the alert reached him. Not through the station's Vox system, not through any official channel, but through the specific, unmediated psychic awareness that astropaths develop after years of service at close quarters. The particular texture of another mind in distress felt the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm announces itself through any measurable instrument. He was already moving before the junior astropath's name appeared on his data slate. Tevris Onal, newly soul-bound, 14 months of service. The specific vulnerability of someone whose psychic shielding was still new enough to be conscious effort rather than second nature, who still had to think about maintaining the barrier between their own perception and the ambient psychic noise of the relay station, the way you have to think about your breathing when someone has just made you aware of it. He found Tevris in the corridor outside the junior quarters, pressed against the wall with both hands flat against the plating, head down, the particular physical posture of someone trying to make themselves small against something that is not coming from any direction they can turn away from. When Morn reached him and put a hand on his shoulder, the young astropath flinched with his entire body. "It's inside," Tevris said. Not to Morn specifically. To the wall, to the corridor, to the middle distance where the thing he was describing lived. It's not coming from anywhere. It's already inside. It was always inside. I just started hearing it. Morn recognized this. Not the specific experience. In 19 years, he had never experienced unsolicited psychic intrusion at Vigil-Secundus, which was part of why the station's darkening would later be classified as inexplicable by every official body that examined the record. The station's psychic shielding was rated among the best in the network. Its natural resonance, the elevated baseline that had made the site attractive to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's founding surveyors, had always been considered an asset rather than a liability. A deeper signal-to-noise ratio, a cleaner channel. The reason Vigil-Secundus's transmissions degraded less in transit than those of comparable stations. He recognized the description. Always inside. I just started hearing it. He had written something almost identical in his own log, the morning after his hands moved without his direction. The sensation of something that was not arriving but revealing itself, surfacing from a depth it had always occupied, into a perception that had simply not been calibrated to reach it before. He settled Tevris. He contacted the station Medicare. He began moving through the quarters corridor to check the remaining junior astropaths, and found, in the space of 23 minutes, that he did not need to check all of them. They were already in the corridor. All 4 of the junior astropaths currently serving at Vigil-Secundus, gathered in the space outside their quarters, with the unplanned, instinctive clustering of people who have each separately realized that proximity to other minds provides some insulation from whatever is moving through their own. They were not panicking. They were very still, in the way that people go still when they are concentrating very hard on something they cannot stop doing. They were all receiving, simultaneously, the same signal Morn confirmed by brief and careful psychic query, not reading them, which would have been an intrusion, but listening at the threshold the way an experienced astropath learns to listen, hearing the shape rather than the content, the same frequency, the same structure, the signal he had first received in the dark of his rest period, the signal whose symbols he had transcribed into 11 groups and carried folded against his skin for 4 days, except it was no longer 11 groups. He could feel it even through his own shielding, thicker than theirs, 19 years of professional maintenance, the well-worn architecture of a mind that had learned to manage its own permeability. He could feel the signal's structure the way you feel the rhythm of music through a wall without hearing the melody. 11 groups and something beyond them. Something is still forming. The 12th group, arriving not as a complete transmission, but as a process, unfolding in real time, in the passive psychic resonance of the station, building itself out of the ambient material the way a crystal builds itself from a supersaturated solution, slowly, inevitably, according to a structure that was always going to be its final shape. He had 4 junior astropaths showing hemorrhage symptoms in a station corridor. He had 12 mid-rank astropaths, whose quarters he had not yet reached. He had a station medicae whose training covered individual psychic injury and had no protocol for choir-wide simultaneous resonance failure. He began doing the only thing available to him, working methodically through the problem in front of him, because the alternative was acknowledging the full scope of what was happening, and the full scope of what was happening was not something he could afford to carry and still function. The mid-rank astropaths were worse, not in the acute physical way that the juniors were worse. The hemorrhage symptoms, the involuntary shaking, the pressed against the wall posture of someone whose shielding had simply never been tested at this load. The mid-ranks had better shielding. Better shielding meant they were receiving the signal more clearly, the way a better antenna receives a broadcast more cleanly, with less noise, with greater fidelity to the original content. 2 of them were transcribing, automatically, involuntarily, without having made any conscious decision to do so, their harnesses strapped on in the middle of the night cycle, quills moving across vellum in the specific, unhurried rhythm of professional reception, their faces carrying the particular blankness of a mind that has ceded its foreground to incoming material. Morn recognized the posture. He had worn it himself. He knew what it looked like from the outside. He gently interrupted both of them, removed the harnesses, checked their biometrics with the station medic's portable equipment, and confirmed what he already knew. Shielding compromised, psychic exposure elevated, both of them in the early stages of what the official classification system called deep resonance immersion, and what astropaths who had experienced it called, without exception, drowning in someone else's certainty. He collected the pages they had transcribed. He folded them into his sleeve without reading them. He told them and told himself that he would read them when he had stabilized the choir, when the immediate crisis was managed, when he had done the job in front of him and earned the right to understand what the job was actually about. He was not certain he believed himself. He noted that uncertainty in his log without elaboration. He spent the next 3 hours moving through the station, floor by floor, managing what he could manage and documenting what he could not. The station medicae, a capable, unflappable woman named Darren Salt, who had treated 17 years of astropathic service injuries and had developed, through that experience, The particular professional calm of someone who has learned that most emergencies look worse than they are until the ones that don't, stayed with him for the first 2 hours and then went to establish a proper treatment station in the medica bay. He trusted her with the physical symptoms. He could not explain to her what was causing them, because explaining it would have required explaining everything, and everything was not yet a coherent enough shape to be explained. At the end of the 3 hours, he had a choir that was symptomatic but stable. 2 astropaths, still in deep resonance immersion, being monitored. 4 juniors sedated and shielded as thoroughly as the station's infrastructure permitted. The mid-ranks managed with effort, with the grim professional determination of people who understood that the alternative to managing was not better. He stood in the corridor outside the medici bay, and he allowed himself, for the first time since finding Tevris against the wall, to feel the full weight of what was happening. He went to find the station's founding records, not because he had a specific hypothesis, because he was a precise man, and precise men, when confronted with phenomena that exceed their current framework, do not wait for the framework to expand on its own. They go looking for the load-bearing structure underneath the thing they don't understand, because the load-bearing structure was there before the thing, and will explain more about its shape than examining the surface ever will. The founding records were in the deep archive. Physical documents, actual pressed vellum, the original survey reports and construction authorizations and site assessments that predated the station's cogitator systems by several years. He accessed them with his standing clearance, which covered administrative records of this classification without restriction. He was looking for the psychic shielding schematics, specifically the original shielding specifications and the site survey data that had determined the shielding requirements. If 17 astropaths were experiencing simultaneous resonance failure despite the station's rated shielding, he wanted to understand what the shielding had been designed for, and whether what was happening now fell within or outside its design parameters. He found the schematics. He found the site survey. He began reading. The site survey was 47 pages. The first 46 described what he expected: resonance measurements, substrate analysis, atmospheric and gravitational data, the standard battery of assessments conducted before any Adeptus Astra Telepathica installation. The elevated psychic resonance was documented extensively, measurements taken at 12 points across the site, averages calculated, comparison data from 12 other candidate sites for this network node. Vigil-Secundus's location had been chosen, the survey confirmed, because its natural resonance was significantly higher than any of the alternatives. Better signal quality, reduced transmission degradation. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica's surveyors had found exactly what they were looking for and had been professionally satisfied with the result. Page 47. A subordinate clause, buried in a paragraph about substrate formation, between 2 sentences about geological stability measurements. The kind of sentence that a reader moving efficiently through a technical document would absorb without fully processing, the way you absorb the fine print of something you have already decided to sign. Note: residual spiritual mass consistent with large-scale terminal psychic event detected in substratum at survey depth of 40 meters. Classified as passive reception aperture of indeterminate origin and unclear operational status. Assessed as non-hazardous to installation operations. No further investigation recommended. He read it 3 times. Passive reception aperture. Something had been received here before the station existed. The elevated resonance the surveyors had measured and documented and enthusiastically selected for. The quality that made Vigil-Secundus the best signal relay in its network. The quality that had justified its construction and maintained its operational value for 40 years. Was not a natural feature of the landscape. It was the residue of something that had died here, something large enough that its death had left a permanent impression in the fabric of reality at this location. A wound in the psychic substrate that had never closed and had, over whatever span of time had passed since the event, developed the specific scar tissue of a receiver, an aperture that caught and concentrated and held psychic signals the way a dish antenna catches and concentrates electromagnetic radiation. Not built, grown, from loss. He kept reading. The founding date of Vigil-Secundus was printed at the top of the first page. He had seen it every time he accessed the founding records in 19 years of service. He had never had reason to look at it as a data point in a sequence. 407 years ago. The first seal received at Vigil Primus, the destroyed predecessor station, approximately 400 years ago. 7 years between the construction of the station, on top of a passive reception aperture of indeterminate origin, and the first documented arrival of the seals in the network. 7 years for the station's infrastructure to settle into the aperture, for the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's equipment to align with the receiver already present in the substratum, for the antenna to finish orienting toward whatever it had always been pointed at. And then the seals began arriving, and they had not stopped since. He sat in the deep archive with the founding records in his hands, and he did not move for a long time. His log records this as a gap, not the 11-second gap of Chamber 7 in another story, but his own gap, his own version of the silence that descends when a mind arrives at a threshold it cannot cross without becoming something that has crossed it. 7 minutes. He sat in the deep archive for 7 minutes, and then he noted what he had found in 3 flat sentences, and he stood, and he began moving toward the relay chamber, because his shielding had been weakening since the junior astropaths clustered in the corridor, and he needed to reinforce it from within the station's infrastructure before it failed entirely. He did not make it to the relay chamber before he heard Eval, not through the Vox, not through any official channel, through the specific, direct, unmediated pathway of 2 psychic minds in proximity with failing shielding between them, which is as close to unfiltered communication as human beings in this universe can come, and which carries not just meaning, but the texture of the mind transmitting it, the weight it is under, the thing it is not saying alongside the thing it is. Her voice in his perception was tired, the tiredness of someone who has been holding something at arm's length for 11 years and has finally, with relief and with grief in equal measure, set it down. Cale, I need you to understand that I have already been receiving the 12th Seal for 11 years. What is happening to the choir now is not the beginning. A pause, not long, the length of a decision being made and then committed to. It is the part where the seal says you run out of time. The channel, if you could call it that, the fragile and involuntary connection of 2 degraded shields in proximity, closed, not gently, the way a door closes when the pressure differential between 2 rooms finally equalizes and there is no longer anything to hold it open. His shielding failed, not catastrophically, not with pain or cascade or the acute physical crisis he had spent the last 3 hours managing with his colleagues. Just gone. The 19 years of careful, professionally maintained architecture that stood between Cale Morn and the full ambient psychic content of a universe that did not moderate itself for human comfort, simply absent. Removed, as he had written in his log later, with the clean specificity of something extracted rather than something broken. The signal arrived without a filter, all of it, at full resolution, across every frequency he had ever been trained to receive, and several he had not known he was capable of receiving, until the capacity for them was the only thing left. He reached for his transcription harness. His hands moved. The station's architecture has been revealed as complicit in everything that has occurred. The passive reception aperture predates the Imperium. The choir is symptomatic, barely stable. Evil has disclosed 11 years of direct seal reception and the knowledge that Morn's time has run out. His shielding is gone. The full transmission is arriving. His hands are moving. The audience knows that the 47 pages currently being transcribed contain the 12th Seal's complete content, and they know the narrator has read those pages. They do not yet know what they cost. The harness has transcribed 47 pages before. It will transcribe 47 pages again. Some instruments remember what they have carried. Some rooms remember what happened in them. Vigil-Secundus has been remembered for 400 years. The fifth and final transmission begins where the shielding ends. Chapter 5. The 12th Seal. This is not the account of what Cael Morn found. This is the account of what Cael Morn became. There is a difference. You will understand it by the end. You will wish you didn't. He was on the floor of the relay chamber when it finished. Not collapsed, not unconscious. Simply on the floor. The way a person ends up seated against a wall after something has moved through them that required every structural resource they possessed to remain upright for as long as they did, and which has now passed, and which has left behind it the specific, clarified stillness of a room after a storm has finished with it. His transcription harness was still strapped to his forearm. The quill had run dry somewhere in the 43rd page. He had continued without it. The final 4 pages transcribed in the faint psychic impression that an astropath's trained hand leaves on vellum, even without ink, visible only when held at an angle to the light, readable only by someone who knew to look. He knew to look. He had left them that way, deliberately. 47 pages on the floor beside him. The complete content of the 12th Seal, received without filter, transcribed without interruption, by a man whose shielding was gone, and whose hands had moved for 4 hours and 11 minutes without his full direction, and who was now sitting in the relay chamber's low emergency lighting, the standard amber of a station in partial power conservation, feeling, for the first time in 19 years, the complete absence of the Astronomican's background luminescence. Not darkness, not the ordinary biological darkness of closed eyes. Something else. Something that the absence of the Astronomican's cold light had revealed, the way removing a lamp from a room reveals that the room was not dark before. It was simply lit by something that was not what you thought was lighting it. He could feel the building. This is where the record becomes difficult to present precisely, not because Morn's log becomes imprecise. It remains to the end the most methodical document I have encountered in 4 months of reconstruction work. It becomes difficult because what he describes in the hours following the reception is a category of experience that the standard vocabulary of astropathic service was not built to contain. And he knew this, and he noted it, and then he described it anyway in the only language available to him, with the specific discipline of a man who has decided that imprecise language, accurately applied, is more useful than precise language that does not reach. He could feel the building, the load-bearing infrastructure of Vigil-Secundus, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, not as physical sensation but as psychic topology, the shape of the station rendered in the new perception that the failed shielding had left behind like a gift he had not asked for and could not return. He could feel the passive reception aperture 40 meters below him in the substratum, the ancient wound in reality that the surveyors had classified as non-hazardous and recommended no further investigation, and built a 40-year relay station directly on top of. He could feel it the way you feel the foundation of a building you are standing in, not directly, not explicitly, but as the specific confidence that the floor will hold. Except the confidence here was inverted. The aperture was not holding anything up. It was holding something open. He could feel 17 minds in the building, not their thoughts, their weight, the specific psychic mass of 17 human beings whose souls had been bound to the Emperor's light, distributed through the station's levels like fixed points in a constellation, each of them dimmer than they should have been, each of them carrying the residue of a night spent receiving something they had not been designed to receive at the volume it had arrived. He catalogued them the way he catalogued everything, methodically, without rushing, noting which were stable and which were still symptomatic, and which were the quiet, undramatic amber of a mind that was present, but had retreated to its minimum functional depth until conditions improved. He found Ival at the edge of his new perception, deepest in the station, in her quarters, lined with 40 years of transcription records. Awake, still. The specific psychic signature of someone who has been waiting, with complete composure, for a thing they have known was coming for 11 years and have now confirmed has arrived. He noted all of this. Then he picked up the 47 pages and began to read what his hands had transcribed. I will tell you what the 12th seal contained in the way that Morn himself chose to record it, which is to say, I will tell you the shape of it rather than the content. This is not evasion. It is the only honest approach to a document whose complete content I have read and whose complete content I will carry from this point forward for the rest of my life, in the way that Ival carried her 11 years, and Morn carried his 19, and Theoden Vrath carried his 40. You do not need the content. The content would be too heavily delivered all at once, and it would obscure the thing that matters, which is not what the seal said, but what the seal was. It was an answer to a question the Imperium had never thought to ask, because the question required a perspective that no human institution had ever occupied long enough to formulate it. The question underneath every seal, running through every verified catastrophe, and every sealed archive, and every darkened relay station, like a load-bearing structure running through a building. Not what will happen, and not what has happened, but what is the shape of what keeps happening, and what does that shape mean, and what approaches that the shape has been pointing toward all along, without any single human mind living long enough to see the whole of it. The 12th seal was not a prophecy. It was not a warning. It was a completed model, the synthesis of 400 years of collected human catastrophe, assembled by something with a perspective long enough and a patience vast enough to watch the entire sequence play out and identify the structure underneath it. Not malevolent, not benevolent. The orientation of something so far outside the scale of human concern that those categories had stopped applying long before the first stone of the first human city was laid, and what the model showed, rendered in the same clean, emotionless, comprehensive language as the fall of Cadia and the death of a chapter and the 17 names listed in the order they died. What it showed was an ending, not the ending, not fire and silence and the void reclaiming what humanity had built across 10,000 years of desperate, costly, magnificent survival. Something more specific and more terrible than that. The ending of the capacity to be surprised by what was coming. The model's final entry, the line that Ival had pressed into his hands in her quarters and told him to read himself. The line whose content he had not told her and had not told anyone, described the moment when the pattern became visible to enough people simultaneously that the response to it could no longer be classification and suppression and the gentle administrative management of people who noticed numbers that didn't add up. It described the threshold, the point at which the Imperium's 10,000-year habit of absorbing catastrophe and continuing would encounter something that the habit was not designed to absorb, because the habit was itself part of the pattern, because the pattern included the coping mechanism alongside the thing being coped with. The final line of the 12th seal said, "The receiver is the transmission." He sat with that for a long time, long enough that his log records another gap. Not 7 minutes this time, not 11 seconds. 41 minutes of silence, during which his biometrics show nothing dramatic, nothing acute, simply the steady and unremarkable readings of a man sitting in a relay chamber in the amber emergency lighting, being very quietly and very completely changed. Ival had left the channel open. He found it through his new perception of the station's infrastructure, felt it the way he felt the aperture in the substratum, as a specific quality in the building's psychic topology, a place where the architecture was oriented outward rather than inward. She had not told him about it. She had not needed to. She had simply left it 11 years ago, when she first understood what the 12th Seal described, and maintained it with the patient, unhurried care of someone tending something that might not be needed for a very long time, and must be ready when it is. An old channel, predating the current Adeptus Astra Telepathica hierarchy by enough centuries that it appeared in the founding records only as a structural footnote, a relay architecture that the station's original builders had incorporated without fully understanding what it was, the way the founding surveyors had incorporated the elevated resonance without fully understanding its origin. It transmitted simultaneously to every active relay station in the network. It carried astropathic material at the full resolution of its source. No degradation, no filtering, no loss in transit. It could not be jammed after transmission had begun. It could be classified after receipt, but classification after receipt meant it had already arrived, and arrival was the only thing that mattered. She had left it open. He thought about 19 years, the specific, accumulated weight of 19 years of precise and professional and quietly dignified service, of transmission queues and archive cross-references and caloric intake logs, and the careful maintenance of shielding, and the deliberate daily practice of remaining within his function. He thought about Tevris Onal pressed against a corridor wall, hands flat against the plating, trying to make himself small against something that was already inside. He thought about Ival's paper, folded so many times the creases were permanent, the handwriting at the bottom that said the 12th arrives with the receiver in a hand that was not hers and not his and not anyone currently living. He thought about a 17-year-old novitiate named Drav Soul, killed in a drainage culvert on an agri-world so obscure it barely registered on imperial charts, listed in the Third Seal with more care than any of the others. The pause in a document composed by something that did not feel, feeling something. He sat down in front of the open channel. He picked up his harness. The quill was dry. He replaced it from the supply drawer beside the transmission console with the automatic efficiency of a man who has performed this specific action 10,000 times and does not need to think about it. He thought for a moment about authorization, about the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's chain of command and the proper escalation procedure for a discovery of this classification level, and the specific wisdom accumulated across 19 years of remaining within his function, about what happened to Theodan Vrath, who had spent 40 years trying to make the Imperium listen through official channels, and had died waiting in a quiet posting where he could trouble no one important. He transmitted the 12th Seal in full to every astropath currently active in the relay network. He did not know how many there were. He did not know how many would understand what arrived. He did not know if understanding was the threshold that mattered, or whether the threshold that mattered was simply receipt. The seal landing in enough minds simultaneously that the suppression architecture could no longer process it faster than it spread, the way a fire outpaces the hands trying to smother it not through intensity, but through distribution. He did not know if it would change anything. He knew that not transmitting would not change anything either, and that between those two uncertainties, there was only one that required him to be the person he had always, underneath 19 years of professional formation, actually been. The transmission took 11 seconds. He noted the irony of the duration in his log. In a tone that was the closest thing to humor, in 407 pages of combined record, and which made me stop reading for a long time when I found it. The channel closed. The relay chamber settled back into its amber quiet. His 47 pages on the floor beside him, and the quill still in his hand, and the new quality of his perception filling the space where the Astronomican's background luminescence had lived for 19 years. The building's shape, the 17 mines at their various depths, the aperture below holding its ancient patient opening toward whatever it had always been pointed at. He folded the 47th page carefully. He pressed it into his sleeve. He thought of a name, not his own, not Ival's, a name he did not know, belonging to a person he would never meet, somewhere in the network, at a relay station he could not identify, sitting at a transcription console in whatever quality of light that station kept during its work cycle, receiving what he had just sent. Someone whose soul binding had left its own permanent impression. Someone whose shielding was intact and maintained and would tonight not be sufficient. Someone who was, at this moment, in the specific luminescent not darkness of their permanent blindness, feeling the texture of the Astronomican change, reaching for their harness, watching their hands begin to move. He did not know their name. He wrote it anyway. The last entry in Cael Morn's transcription record, the final line on the final page of the document sealed into the foundational cavity of Vigil-Secundus's relay chamber wall. Behind the section of plating he had prepared for someone who would look is a blank space where a name should be. Not an omission, not an incomplete entry. A blank space held open deliberately for whoever was receiving right now, and whoever would receive after them, and whoever after that. A record with room left in it. He was the 12th. He was not the last. I found his record 11 months after Vigil-Secundus went dark. I found it where he left it, behind the wall plating, in the foundational cavity, sealed in the way of someone who trusted that the right hands would eventually reach it. I have spent 4 months reconstructing what preceded it. I have read every page of the 47. I have held Ival's folded paper, recovered from her quarters, from the inside fold of a robe she left hanging on its hook, as though she expected to return to it. The creases permanent, the paper soft with decades of handling. And I have read the line at the bottom in the handwriting that belongs to no one currently living. I know what the last line of the 12th seal says. I know what the receiver as the transmission means, and I know why Morn didn't explain it, and I know why Ival waited 19 years rather than 17 or 15, or the first moment she could have found him, and I know what the passive reception aperture in the substratum of Vigil-Secundus was pointing at, and I know what the absence is that the model has been tracking for 400 years, and which the pattern of every seal has been describing from the outside. I have known all of this since the 3rd week of my reconstruction work. My hands have been unsteady since then. Not trembling, not dramatically, visibly shaking. Just not steady in the way that a precise instrument registers a change in the field it is measuring even when the change is too small for the human senses to confirm. I have been doing this work for 4 months. My shielding was intact when I arrived at Vigil-Secundus. I am writing this account in the amber emergency lighting of the relay chamber, seated on the floor with my back against the wall below the cavity where his record was hidden, because the station's primary power has been in conservation mode since I sent my team back to the transport with the physical documents and told them I needed 1 more hour to complete my notes. That was 6 hours ago. My transcription harness is on the desk across the room. I have not put it on. I am not going to put it on. I am going to finish these notes and seal them into the cavity alongside the space where his record was, and walk to the transport and leave this station and file my report through official channels and do everything a precise and professional person does when they have completed a reconstruction and must now carry what the reconstruction contained. I am going to do all of that. My hands are moving toward the harness. I am not directing them. Her name was Fenavalis. His name was Cael Morn. Yours is the name in the blank space. The transmission is still going. This story was written so that it would not stay where it happened. It has not stayed. You received it. You are still receiving it. The channel is open. It has always been open. And somewhere in the dark between what you knew before this began and what you know now, something has noted your name in the order it will need.
It is very patient.
It has been waiting since before the first light.